Hey folks, tonight we're diving into a truly thrilling topic, mental health in the Middle Ages. Feeling anxious, down, or just plain off? Well, turns out the local health plan definitely didn't cover that. So before you get comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe only if you actually dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Always fun to see who's tuning in from around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe fire up a fan for that soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's journey together. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, mental health, mood, energy, thoughts, and yes, even your tendency to cry over burnt porridge were blamed on some kind of fluid inside your body, not metaphors, actual bodily fluids. And yes, someone somewhere probably tried to measure them. This ancient system traces back to the Greeks, especially Hippocrates and Galen, and it stuck around way longer than it should have. The theory of the four humors said your health, personality, and mood were all controlled by the balance of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each fluid came with its own personality type. Too much blood. You're the cheerful, energetic type until you get cranky and start bleeding like a leech feast. Extra yellow bile made you angry and hot-headed. Perfect for fighting, terrible for dinner parties. Black bile was linked to melancholy, what we now call depression. Back then, it was mood imbalance from cold, dry weather, and thinking too much. And phlegm, that's slow, calm. Maybe the guy was just tired. So if you felt sad, no therapy needed. You just needed a bucket and a guy with a knife. The favored cure for emotional suffering was bloodletting, a charming little trick where someone sliced open a vein, hoping you'd feel better before passing out. If that didn't work, you got prescribed laxatives because obviously when your soul aches, it must be your gut. Doctors, and I'm using that term, loosely diagnosed you by asking deep questions like, feeling wet or dry today? They might check your pee, look at your poop, or even sniff your breath. The conclusion, always some form of humor imbalance. Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or just too complicated to fix without divine intervention. Keep in mind, this wasn't fringe stuff. This was mainstream medicine for centuries. So when you picture a medieval person having a panic attack, don't think of your friend nervously offering you tea. Imagine a robed guy with a fluid chart and a really sharp knife saying, "Let's drain that sadness out." In medieval Europe, if you felt emotionally, mentally, or spiritually off and couldn't blame sin, demons, or your neighbor's weird bread, there was one obvious culprit left: the moon. Yes. People believed that bright orb in the sky had a direct impact on your mental state. The term lunatic wasn't just made up. It comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. Folks truly believed too much moonlight exposure could scramble your brain like eating undercooked eggs. This wasn't just folklore. Doctors, priests, philosophers, and even the guy yelling near the well all accepted it. The idea was that the moon, a celestial body with feelings, could affect your bodily fluids, especially brain fluids, which were thought to spill around your skull like sad soup every full moon. People acting weird during a full moon weren't stressed, overloaded, or mentally ill. They were just plain crazy. Some got locked up temporarily until the lunar cycle passed. Basically, medieval healthcare's version of wait it out. The moon also got blamed for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and basically anything you couldn't fix with soup, leeches, or prayer. They had nervous problems. Basically, they were just crazy. Some even got locked up temporarily until the lunar cycle passed. Yep, that was medieval healthcare's version of just wait it out. The moon also got blamed for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and basically anything you couldn't fix with soup, leeches, or a bit of prayer. If you were up all night, wandering around or crying, they didn't ask about your childhood. Nope. They asked about the sky. Even animals weren't safe. Farmers swore that sheep got spooked and dogs howled weirdly at night. And if your cow kicked over a cart or your pig ran off into the woods, someone was definitely muttering, "The moon's up to something." Of course, zero scientific proof for any of this. But hey, back then, science wasn't really a thing anyway. Most medical texts casually mention astrology like we do caffeine today, and treatments often included not just herbs and diet changes, but also planetary alignments, because sometimes it wasn't madness, just bad moon energy. If your mental health took a nosedive crying, yelling at trees, or spouting rhymes, the first person you'd see wasn't a doctor. It was the local priest. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, the mind was a spiritual battleground, and any weird behavior got instantly interpreted through a theological lens. Depression. Maybe you sinned and forgot to mention it. Anxiety. Clear sign the devil's squatting in your soul. Hearing voices. Classic demon Airbnb situation. Basically, priests were mental health professionals, except instead of therapy, they prescribed confession, fasting, and a stern reminder you were made from dirt and maybe should act like it. If you showed signs of what we now call a mental illness, the priest diagnosed it morally. Did you skip church, lust after the neighbor's wife, or laugh too much? Yeah, that's suspicious. Maybe you don't need herbs, but a good old-fashioned guilt trip for more serious stuff like hallucinations, muteness, or bizarre behavior. The church had stronger tools. These included prayer, pilgrimages, and in extreme cases, minor exorcisms. You know, just making sure your sadness wasn't a demon in disguise. Can't be too careful. Even everyday emotions were suspect. Too much joy, vanity. Deep sadness, spiritual laziness, aka adia. Basically, medieval depression treated with hymns and guilt. If you were sad, you didn't need support. You had a moral problem and probably weren't trying hard enough. Ironically, many found the church's explanations comforting. In a world without neuroscience, thinking suffering had big meaning was oddly reassuring. It gave structure to chaos, even if the treatment meant a lot of chanting. But if you had mental health issues in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't compassion. It was a polite priest who wasn't afraid to accuse you of being demon-possessed. So, if you heard voices, hallucinated, or just lovingly chatted with your soup, nowadays you might get therapy, or at least a mental health podcast recommendation. Back then, exorcism. Yup. The go-to treatment for many mental disorders wasn't meds or rest, but a vigorous, theatrical spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you act weird, it's not stress or trauma. It's Beelzebub making himself comfy in your soul, and he's not paying rent. There were two types of exorcisms. The smaller one was basically a serious prayer circle with holy water and mumbling. The bigger one, a full-on live show starring a very worried patient, a robed priest, and a choir of monks nervously humming Latin. The rituals varied, but essentials stayed the same: chanting, Bible reading, crossing yourself, relics, and occasionally yelling things like "get lost," "unclean spirit" if you jumped. That was proof it worked. If not, they cranked up the volume. Some records describe patients tied down, sprinkled with salt, or forced to drink holy water, staring you down, and he's not even paying rent. There were two kinds of exorcisms. The smaller one was basically a serious prayer circle with holy water and mumbling, while the bigger one was a full-on live show featuring a very nervous patient, a priest in a heavy robe, and a choir of monks humming Latin nervously. The rituals varied, but the essentials were the same: chanting, Bible reading, crossing yourself, relics, and occasionally yelling stuff like "get out," "foul spirit" if you jumped. That was proof it worked. If you didn't flinch, they'd shout louder. Some records even say patients were tied up, sprinkled with salt, or forced to drink holy water. Others fasted for days. This could make anyone act weird. One unlucky soul was said to have had sage and burning incense waved around their ear to chase out the demon, which we now know was probably just some bad ventilation. And if nothing worked, you were either beyond help or tragically misdiagnosed as evil incarnate. But not all exorcisms were scary. In many villages, they used burning sage and frankincense to shoo demons out of ears. Yeah, that's a thing, and what we'd call a major misunderstanding of ventilation. And if none of that worked, well, you were basically written off as beyond help or tragically misdiagnosed as inherently evil. But not every exorcism was a horror show. In lots of villages, it was a community event where everyone gathered in the town square to watch supernatural battles, old school style. Think of it like medieval spiritual theater, part religious ritual, part entertainment, and part neighborhood gossip kickoff. But honestly, most folks doing the exorcisms weren't villains. They were just overwhelmed, traumatized, mentally unwell, or unlucky enough to freak out near a bishop. Now, suppose you're not so freaked out that you need an exorcism, but dinner still feels like a nightmare. You cry for no reason, forget your own name sometimes, or spend way too long staring philosophically at the firewood. In that case, treatment didn't involve ropes or screaming, just lots of praying, maybe locked in a room for a bit. Some groups called this a gentle approach to mental health. They'd tell you your problem was spiritual and could be fixed by self-reflection, discipline, and of course, endless repentance. Basically, medieval mental health care boiled down to, have you tried feeling worse about it? The logic was, suffering cleansed the soul, so if you were suffering mentally, congrats, you were halfway there. Monks and nuns, some genuinely kind, others just overworked, might guide you through silent meditation, prayer, vigils, fasting, and sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces until either the devil left or you forgot what happiness felt like. Some folks voluntarily joined monasteries as medieval retreat centers. They weren't exactly gladiator arenas, more like spiritual timeout rooms. You got a cell, a Bible, and 8 hours of chanting a day. Every now and then, you'd even get stew. People still debate whether this helped mental illness or just masked it with religious exhaustion. Then there were relics, feeling unwell, touching a saint's bone fragment, struggling to sleep, napping near a martyr's blood jar, and crying for no reason. That's the whole point of Saint Euphemia's toe. The idea was, holiness was contagious, like kindness or fleas. To be fair, this was the closest thing to caring for your well-being in many places. Unlike exorcisms or beatings, prayer methods usually didn't leave bruises. Just lots of chanting and being told your thoughts were the problem. Sometimes monks actually helped people through community, quiet, and routine. Other times, they just told you to fast and hope enlightenment struck by sunrise. Suppose your condition went beyond awkwardly staring at candles and changing sizes. Maybe you'd start wandering barefoot around town, mumbling about angels or loudly debating theology with barnyard animals. At that point, the medieval response wasn't support groups. It was a stone room with one window and no doorknob on your side. Into the monastery cell, or as some historians nicely put it, protective isolation. These cells were tucked inside monasteries or churches and seen as a mercy. Emphasis on observation, hopefully no chains or torture, but you were encouraged not to leave. Sometimes for years. Bare bones room, blank walls, maybe a straw mat, and if you were lucky, a tiny window for food, mostly cold meals delivered twice a day. Human contact was rare because they believed your madness could spread emotionally, spiritually, or atmospherically. Still, you weren't completely forgotten. Monks might pray for your soul occasionally. A kind brother might bring herbs or sing hymns outside your door with a tone that said, "You're not the worst we've seen." Sometimes that locked room wasn't part of a monastery, but an actual public institution, the medieval version of a mental hospital. These places weren't common until later, but some existed in medieval Islamic cities, and by the 13th century in spots like London and Paris. So, what's the goal here, Shelter? Not treatment, and definitely not recovery. But credit where it's due, the medieval mindset wasn't always heartless. Lots of folks believed the mentally unwell were closer to the divine, touched by God, or maybe just walking the thin line between prophecy and plain old weird behavior. They thought maybe these people were special, blessed, or just a bit off in a holy way. But, honestly, locking someone up for their own good was way easier than figuring out how to actually help them. Families often begged monasteries to take in their troubled relatives, promising donations in return. The alternative, trying to explain to your neighbors why Uncle Thaddeus is shouting Latin in the cabbage patch. If you were a woman in medieval Europe feeling overwhelmed, cranky, or crying a lot, maybe after your 11th kid, or your 3rd husband died of the plague, congratulations, you were probably diagnosed with hysteria. Diagnosis is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Hysteria wasn't really a diagnosis, but more like a catch-all excuse for why this woman's behavior made men uncomfortable. Cry too much, hysterical, crying not enough, suspicious, maybe a witch, having opinions, ambition, or just tired must be a womb problem. The term comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. And get this. According to the theory, brace yourself, the womb wasn't fixed in place and could wander freely through the body, causing trouble wherever it went. Yep, you heard that right. A rogue womb was blamed for everything from anxiety to chronic sighing, somewhere in your belly. Your womb was supposedly going rogue and ruining your whole day. Symptoms of hysteria included shortness of breath, anxiety, fainting, emotional outbursts, and quoting an actual medieval source, thinking too much, truly a brutal condition. Treatments were all over the place. A priest might recommend fasting and prayer. A doctor could prescribe herbs, and in some awkward cases, manual stimulation was ordered to calm the womb, performed by midwives or later on early gynecologists who definitely lacked proper supervision. Marriage was also considered a cure. If a woman was single, she needed a husband to settle down, if married. Obviously, she just needed another pregnancy. Either way, her mental health had to work harder and rest less. And if she kept acting weird, seeing visions, refusing housework, or thinking too much in Latin, things could get worse. Some women were accused of witchcraft because, well, nothing screams mental illness like growing herbs and asking questions. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Sometimes women found support in monasteries, where daily demands were lighter, and emotional suffering was seen as part of spiritual struggle. Some nuns even wrote about their pain in ways that suspiciously sound modern, without demon metaphors. Still, is if you were a medieval woman with feelings. Your best mental health strategy was simple speak, softly, keep it short, and never, ever talk to cats in public. In a time when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and doctors swore to make your soul bleed through your ankles. The real medieval mental health heroes were herbalists usually, older women with gardens, cats, and suspiciously good intuition. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were unofficial therapists without licenses. They didn't ask how you felt. They asked when the pain started, how you sleep, and if your mother-in-law was still bugging you. Their method, simple, tea, potions, and chats, though the chatting was often disguised as herbal advice. Chatting with cats in public. Back when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and doctors swore they'd make your soul bleed through your ankles. The real mental health heroes of the Middle Ages were herbalists usually, older women with gardens, cats, and suspiciously good intuition. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial therapists of their day. They didn't ask how you felt. They asked when the pain started, how you slept, and if your mother-in-law was still annoying you. Their methods were simple tea, medicine, and chatting, though the chatting was usually disguised as herbal advice. You'd sit in a smoky straw hut surrounded by dried plants, and soon you'd be sipping something made from valerian root and lavender while complaining about the neighbor's pig. It was like therapy that also cured warts. Herbalists treated sadness with calming infusions. Anxiety got soothed with chamomile and oils. If you were really suffering, you could try mugwort, saint, John's wort, or in desperation, a dose of poppy extract. They called it a sleep aid. You might call it an accidental time travel trip. Most of these women weren't formally trained, but their healing methods came from generations of passed down knowledge, sharp observation, and what modern medicine would call actually listening to patients, though that also made folks suspicious. The church saw them as threats. After all, they worked outside the religious system, didn't quote the Bible, and weren't insisting every problem was rooted in sin. Some towns quietly appreciated them. Others accused them of witchcraft if they got too popular, too effective, or too confident in public. Still, they were often the only comfort for people suffering from what we'd now call depression, trauma, or burnout, if you were lucky. The village herbalist knew how to mix calming herbs, light a protective candle, and tell you, no, you're not cursed, you're just tired and seriously undervalued. Was their treatment perfect? Of course not. Sometimes they rubbed onions on your feet, but compared to being locked in a stone room or having a monk wield a screaming goat skull over you, the herbalist's approach was downright luxurious. So far, we've talked about prayers, isolation, and a charming herbalist with a license no one issued. But medieval mental health had another solution too, the kind that makes you wonder if doctors were making diagnoses based on dreams and pantry snacks. Let's start with the dead owl treatment. Yep, if you were obsessed with sadness or overthinking, a common cure was to tie a dead owl to your head. People believed the owl, symbol of wisdom, could absorb your confusion or sorrow through your scalp. In reality, it mostly absorbed flies. You, feeling especially anxious, try emerald dust. Yes, ground up jewels. Docs recommended crushing real gems and rubbing the glittery powder on your chest or ingesting a bit. Not only useless, but it could wreck your digestion and your jewelry collection. Then there were cures involving astrology, not so much medical as star energy checkups. Your patient's mental breakdown, probably Mars throwing a tantrum. The fix, wait till Jupiter looks friendlier. A medieval medical guide suggested wrapping the patient in wolfskin during a thunderstorm to scare off madness. Another tip, whisper into a black dog's left ear and let it run away with your sadness, like a sad, furry therapist courier. You could also find recipes using smoky herbs stuffed into pigeons, then waved near your head. Nobody knows exactly what that did, but it smelled nice and annoyed the pigeons quite a bit. And if nothing else worked, there was always pilgrimage, the medieval fix-all. Grab your sandals, take a stick, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. If lucky, you'd find peace of mind, or at least blisters big enough to forget how you felt. These weird cures remind us that medieval medicine wasn't pure poison, just misinformation, mostly trial and error, and sometimes bird-based. And hey, if nothing else, they gave people hope, which back then was basically Prozac. Every medieval town, big or small, seemed to have that one guy, you know, the weirdly dressed dude mumbling to himself, sometimes blessing chickens, sometimes cursing puddles, the town madman, and weirdly, society didn't always lock him up or make him ask for holy water. They just let him be in an era when mental health was involved me, sometimes blessing chickens, sometimes cursing puddles, a town weirdo, and strangely, society didn't always lock him up or make him beg for holy water. They just let him be in an era when mental health was most misunderstood and most feared. This was oddly progressive. People with obvious mental illnesses weren't always outcasts. They often got swept up in daily life, enduring it like bad weather, or like a goat who thinks it owns the street. The madman or madwoman, though women were more likely accused of. Witchcraft held a special spot in medieval social order, not quite a threat, not quite a joke. And staring at the sun, people figured it was divine prophecy, or just Wednesday. They often got nicknames like Old Wanderin' Will, Crazy Meg, or Silly Tom. Notice how those sound suspiciously like bar names. Yeah, that says a lot about how much booze was involved when people thought about madness. These characters usually lived on the outskirts, crashing in abandoned mills, church porches, or wooden barrels straight out of a Dionysus-themed party. Townsfolk might toss them some food, shoes, or even, weirdly, a baby. Kids were told not to stare, which of course meant they stared non-stop. Sometimes their odd behavior even inspired small acts of charity. A baker might leave them pie crusts. A blacksmith might fix a crooked stick. Medieval communities, superstitious as they were, could get pretty kind, especially when eternal damnation was on the line. But if the lunatic got too loud, too violent, or just plain too annoying, patience ran out fast. Then came the priests. Isolation, or worse, tolerance has limits, especially when the sick stopped being fun and started causing trouble. Nowadays, we get that depression is a complex mix of brain chemistry, life situations, and sometimes just crappy Mondays. But in medieval times, if you constantly felt down, tired, or like life was a slow landslide, congrats. You were guilty of acedia. Acedia wasn't seen as a mental health issue. Nope. It was a failure of spirit, one of the OG deadly sins before laziness stole the spotlight. Acedia was the sadness before God's blessings, or more practically, spiritual apathy, joylessness, and the medieval version of lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Monks were especially prone, calling it the midday demon. Imagine a monk copying hymns, staring at the wall, wondering why the heck he's even doing this. Today, we'd call that burnout. In the 12th century, it was a moral crisis demanding immediate scolding and probably more prayers. Those suffering acedia weren't comforted. They were told to pray more, work harder, and quit being selfish. Depression wasn't a condition. It was laziness with a fancy name. If your soul didn't feel joyful, that was your fault. Maybe you hadn't repented enough. Maybe you were secretly proud. Or, and here's the nuclear option, you were letting Satan win. And if you dared to talk about your sadness, you weren't just criticized, you were considered contagious. Sadness could spread like emotional mold, and monasteries didn't want it seeping into their walls. Regular folks weren't immune either. If you didn't find joy in your work, it wasn't because you were burnt out or grieving. Nope. It meant you needed to confess and maybe build a little hut to dump your sins in. Ironically, some monks' writings about battling acedia sound pretty modern. They describe paralysis, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy, the cure was fasting and listing your sins alphabetically. Bad Mondays, but in the Middle Ages. If you constantly felt down, tired, or like life was a slow-moving landslide, congratulations, you'd be guilty of acedia. Acedia wasn't considered a mental health issue. It was seen as a spiritual failure, one of the first deadly sins before laziness finally stole the show. Fame and became a top-tier sin. Acedia was basically the blues before God's blessings, or more practically, spiritual apathy and a joy deficit. The medieval version, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, monks were especially prone to this condition, which they poetically called the noon demon. Imagine a monk copying hymns, zoning out at a wall, wondering, what's the point of any of this today? We'd call that burnout, but in the 12th century, it was a full-blown moral crisis demanding instant scolding and extra prayers. Those suffering from acedia got zero comfort. The advice, pray more, work harder, and quit being selfish. Depression wasn't even a condition back then. It was just laziness in disguise. If your soul wasn't happy, that was your fault. Maybe you just hadn't repented enough. Maybe you were secretly proud. Or here's the nuclear option: Satan was winning. And if you dared admit your sadness aloud, you didn't just get judged. You were seen as contagious. Sadness was like emotional mold, and monasteries did not want that stuff seeping into their walls. Regular folks weren't safe either. If you didn't find joy in your work, it wasn't burnout or grief. Nope. It was a sign you needed to confess, and maybe build a little confession hut to dump all your sins. Ironically, some monks' writings on acedia sound pretty modern. They describe paralysis, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal thoughts, but instead of therapy, they prescribed fasting and listing sins alphabetically. Back when most people owned 2 shirts, one flea-ridden, you'd think laughter might be encouraged, a little joy, a giggle to survive the plague, mud, and leeches of daily life. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always a happiness sign. It was often a moral warning flag. Sure, peasants laughed. The jester laughed. Even monks cracked a smile if a goose did something particularly embarrassing. But official views from theologians and chronicle writers, basically the fun police said, laughter could be dangerous, a gateway to chaos, sin, and even dancing. The church, always on high alert for invisible creatures whispering in your ear, limited your options, campfire decorations for prophets, lunatics, or the future. Not much overlap there. Interestingly, some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claim to see vivid images and chat with divine beings because they were cloistered, educated, and a bit scary. They got a pass, but if you were a farmer named Bertram chatting theology with squirrels, don't hold your breath for an illustrated manuscript. in the medieval world. Mental illness swung between extremes. You could be a curiosity or a family shame, and often both, depending on whether the village market was open. Let's set the scene. If someone clearly mentally ill wandered town, mumbling, dancing in the rain, or arguing wildly with a bucket, they might attract attention, not scorn. Warned against too much fun, Thomas Aquinas, who apparently needed to work on his sense of humor, believed laughter should be measured and serve a higher purpose. Uncontrolled laughter, a sign of mental disorder, maybe even demonic possession, because, really, who laughs without a reason? They answer people with a sense of humor. Of course, women got judged twice as hard. A woman laughing clearly has some agenda, maybe a witch, while a stern, quiet woman is either very devout or just plain boring. And let's not forget the laughter of the insane. If someone laughs at the wrong time, like at a funeral or while milking a goat, that's not just odd. It's proof of mental illness, demon possession, or both. Uncontrollable giggles are basically a red flag with a jingle bell on top. In some monasteries, novices were banned from laughing during meals, prayers, or any activity that might spark social bonding. Joy was theoretically fine, but only if it came from within, not the kind of nauseous, booze-fueled laughter when someone slips on a turnip. Yet people still laughed. Humor survived in village festivals, witty poetry, and that one guy in every town who makes weird armpit noises. But it was always a little risky. Fun was allowed, just not trusted. Talking to cats nowadays is quirky. Back then, probably heresy, borderline alarming, and depending on your tone, a reason to question your sanity or book you a light exorcism. See, medieval society had very clear ideas about who you could and couldn't talk to. Humans were fine, priests were better, but if you started chatting with animals, invisible angels, or anything, that didn't talk back. People raised an eyebrow and often grabbed a torch. Let's start with animals. Cats walked a fine line. On one side, pest controllers. On the other, slick, mysterious, and never seen in church. If you chatted with your tabby too much, folks might think it was your familiar, sent by the devil to whisper forbidden herbal remedies, and where your neighbor hides the cheese. Birds were also suspicious. Medieval animal books are packed with weird facts. If someone said a crow could tell the future, that wasn't poetic. It was a betrayal of reason. Even dogs, humanity's loyal pals, were okay until they started showing up in your dreams, wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then there were angels, according to countless religious texts, everywhere, watching, protecting, and sometimes delivering creepy messages in storms. If you claimed to see or hear them often, you might be considered holy, or, if your timing was off, crazy or possessed. The difference often came down to whether you were in a monastery or yelling at clouds in the town square, and, of course, your imaginary friends. Most kids got a pass, but adults, if you said you talked to invisible beings giving you orders, your options were limited campfire decoration for prophets, lunatics, or the future. Not a lot in common there. Interestingly, Some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claimed vivid visions and divine chats, and since they lived cloistered, were educated and a bit scary, they got a pass. But if you were a farmer named Bertram, chatting theology with squirrels, don't expect to be illustrating manuscripts anytime soon. In medieval times, mental illness swung, invisible creatures giving you advice. The choices were limited campfire decorations for prophets, lunatics, or future seers, not much overlap. Interestingly, some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claimed to see vivid visions and chat with holy figures. Being cloistered, educated, and slightly intimidating, they got a free pass. But if you were a farmer named Bertram, chatting theology with squirrels, good luck getting a fancy illustrated manuscript. In medieval times, mental illness swung between extremes. You could be a curiosity or a family embarrassment, often both depending on whether the village market was open. Let's start with the scene. If someone clearly mentally ill wandered town mumbling, dancing in the rain, or fiercely arguing with a bucket, they might get attention rather than scorn. In fact, they could become a fixture of village life, like the bell tower or the goat. Let's start with what's in front of us. If someone clearly mentally ill wandered town mumbling, dancing in the rain, or fiercely arguing with a bucket, they might get attention rather than scorn. They could become a village staple, like the bell tower or the neighborhood goat. People would watch, whisper, maybe even laugh, not because they were cruel, well, not always, but it came from this weird mix of fascination and fear, because deep down, everyone worried. Next week. That could be you if you get whacked on the head or eat some bad eel pie. In some places, these folks were called natural fools, which sounds insulting but was oddly affectionate by medieval standards. They were seen as innocent, almost childlike, and sometimes believed to be touched by God, fate, or just a really bad moon phase. Eventually, you might get food, a place to stay, and a nickname. Not ideal, but in a world with no therapy, it beat being locked in a tower. But family life, yeah, that was a whole different mess. If your loved one was quietly struggling, maybe depressed, withdrawn, or obsessed with what we now call anxiety, it was usually treated as a private shame. In medieval terms, it was basically a taboo subject. Shame was a powerful social currency, and a troubled mind in the family could ruin the whole lineage. Some families hid their sick relatives away. Others shipped them off to monasteries or pilgrimages, hoping holy geography would work where herbal tea failed. In sadder cases, people were outright abandoned, especially if they were seen as troublemakers, or worse, wedding crashers of shame. Public mental health care basically non-existent. Shame filled the gap where support systems should have been. No clinics, no outreach programs, just whispered prayers and pretending everything was fine. By the late Middle Ages, around the 15th century, give or take a plague or two, things started to change. Not quickly, not smoothly, but if you squinted hard enough, you could spot the first signs of compassion sneaking into every scholar's thoughts. Philosophy and science began to creep into the conversation, thanks to medical texts in Arabic preserved and translated in places like Spain and Sicily. Western Europe got reintroduced to ancient Greek thinkers, not modern psychologists, mind you. But at least they started thinking the human mind wasn't just a demon puppet show. Scholars began to suggest madness might come from bodily imbalances, not just sin or sorcery. Doctors started writing treatises discussing melancholia and mania, with fewer Bible quotes and more anatomy. Don't get too excited. Treatments still included things like leeches on the temples, but hey, at least people were reading. Around the same time, the idea of charitable care started to grow. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, the first hospitals began separating mental patients from regular wards. Some even offered gardens, music, and friendly chats, still rough around the edges, but better than having a priest screaming at you while you're tied to a goat post. The printing press didn't hurt either. More books meant ideas about the mind spread faster than syphilis at a midsummer fair. This planted seeds for the Renaissance, when mental illness started climbing the ladder from cursed to maybe these folks need some help. Of course, not everything changed. People still feared what they didn't understand, and the line between madness and mysticism was as thin as a monk's bedsheet. But the foundation was set. Slowly, the mad stopped being seen as just vessels of sin or divine wrath. They, in a totally different way, began to be seen as human capable of mistakes, suffering, and worthy of care, but not cuddles or pampering. Mental patients out of regular wards, some even got gardens, music, and cozy chats. Still not fancy, but better than a priest yelling at you while you're tied to a goat post. The printing press didn't hurt either. More books meant ideas about the mind spread faster than syphilis at the midsummer fair. This helped spark the Renaissance, when mental illness started climbing from you're cursed to maybe you need help, or climbing the slope from you're cursed to hey, maybe you need some help. Of course, not everything changed overnight. People still feared what they didn't understand, and the line between madness and mysticism was as thin as a monk's bedsheet. But the groundwork was laid, slowly. The insane stopped being just vessels for sin or divine wrath. But the groundwork was laid, slowly. The crazy folks stopped being seen as just vessels for sin or divine rage. Instead, they started being treated like humans flawed, suffering, and somewhat deserving of care, not cuddles or pampering. Though, that change took centuries. From the outside, noble life looked sacred, fresh-smelling hallways, diamond-studded outfits, servants jumping at your whim, whether in Versailles or behind Kyoto's royal walls. Aristocrats always radiated perfection, timeless elegance like a portrait. But what the public didn't was the suffocating reality under the makeup and stiff rituals for many nobles. This glamorous life wasn't paradise, it was more like a velvet prison. Every minute of a noble's day, from waking up to folding napkins, was dictated by unwritten rules or ceremonies. In France, nobles had to perform the lever ritual every morning, where courtiers lined up just to watch the king get out of bed. Skipping it wasn't an option. Miss your cue, and gossip spreads faster than wildfire. Your influence takes a nosedive. Your enemies grin, and at Versailles, losing social credit was way worse than losing cash. Across the globe in Japan, nobles at the Kyoto court faced a different but equally suffocating scenario. The elite were expected to master poetry, calligraphy, music, and all things exquisitely refined. Every word, every bow, every sleeve flick was political theater. Screw it up. And it's social suicide. Even fun was a performance. Balls weren't just parties, they were alliance tests. A stroll in the garden could turn into a silent battlefield of looks and backhanded insults. You weren't just living your life, you were acting in an eternal play, where everyone's watching and your legacy is the target. Yet, very few nobles escaped because the very privileges that made them admired were also their chains. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, debts, and constant surveillance from rivals meant they rarely controlled their own fate. Behind closed doors in these powerhouses, many nobles faced mental breakdowns, quiet rebellions, or deep despair. But in public, they smiled, always smiled. That's the great noble paradox. The more clout you had, the less freedom you enjoyed, born on a throne, but often dying without ever living for yourself. When you picture a noble strutting through Versailles in silk stockings, or a lady gliding downstairs dripping in pearls, the last thing on your mind is debt collectors. But behind all that glam, a surprising number of nobles were broke, turns out. Keeping up the illusion of wealth cost way more than actual riches. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might drop more cash on a new waistcoat or ball gown than on maintaining an entire estate. Well, because fashion was currency. Fall behind, and you vanish politically, socially, and finally, financially. Courtiers gambled huge sums not just at cards, but on horse races, land speculation, and high-stakes alliances. Many nobles mortgaged ancestral lands just to fund one more socially significant season, and the king not exactly lending a helping hand. Louis XIV kept nobles close, not just physically, but economically. He encouraged lavish spending at court to keep them dependent, distracted, and loyal. A bankrupt noble was a controllable noble. Across the Channel in England, nobles weren't doing much better during the Georgian era. Lords and ladies often lived in fancy London homes, funded entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, and hat makers sometimes waited months, even years, for payment. Many families teetered on collapse, hoping their daughters would marry richer men or a distant cousin would kick the bucket and leave them a title and estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles were granted huge swaths of land by the sea, yet many still lacked cash. Wealth was illiquid. Lavish Moscow lifestyles demanded constant borrowing. Discreet brothels handled crowns and swords. Family jewels were sold under candlelight behind locked doors, making hats wait months, sometimes years before getting paid. Lots of families teetered on the edge of collapse, pinning hopes on their daughters marrying rich guys or some distant cousin kicking the bucket to leave them a title and an estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles got huge land grants with plenty of coastline, but a lot of them were still cash poor, wealth without liquidity. The lavish Moscow lifestyle meant constant borrowing, Discreet brothels dealt with crowns and swords. Family heirlooms sold under candlelight behind locked doors. Japan's noble class wasn't doing much better in peacetime when samurai shifted from warriors to bureaucrats during the Tokugawa era. Many nobles became mostly ceremonial, losing real power. Stipends shrank, but costs stayed the same. Some took side gigs. Yep, actual jobs teaching poetry or managing land just to keep face, but admitting money troubles. That was humiliating, so debts piled up in secret. Lesson learned, but admitting you're broke? That's a royal insult, so debts piled up in secret. The takeaway: nobility isn't about financial stability. It's about how well you can fake being rich, and usually, that act comes with a heavy price in heartache. Scandal, that's the nobility's unofficial second language. Love affairs, sparkly jewels, secret kids, whispered betrayals. The shinier the public image, the dirtier the private truth. Nobles had power, prestige, and perks. But what many lacked was self-control. At Versailles, courtiers lived so cramped they barely had privacy. Yet, illicit affairs thrived. Queen Marie Antoinette was constantly accused of cozying up to Swedish nobles or her own lady-in-waiting. Most of those rumors were nonsense, but they stuck because everyone knew someone was definitely up to no good. The court thrived on gossip, and scandals weren't just tolerated, they were headline news. Your name in someone else's bedroom could either boost your influence or ruin your bloodline. Meanwhile, in England, noble reputations got trashed at beauty salons and casinos. Take Lord Byron, rumored to have had a kid with his half-sister, didn't stop him from being famous. But it did cast a dark shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have mistresses, just not too many. And definitely not the wrong kind. Dating actresses, commoners, or foreign spies could get you exiled, jailed, or in rare cases, prematurely dead. In the Russian Empire, Catherine the Great's court was famous for its openness. The Empress herself had plenty of lovers, often hand-picked and boosted to power positions. But it wasn't just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly scheming, mixing politics with bedroom games. Affairs weren't about love. They were power plays, even in Japan's refined Han court, where restraint and poetry ruled. Scandal slipped through haikus and love letters. A noblewoman might welcome a guest at midnight whose identity she'd never reveal, but her next poem, shared among the elite, could be loaded with enough hints to ignite wild speculation. Yet the most dangerous scandals were the ones never written down or announced at court. Crimes like treason, espionage, and blood betrayals. These whispers echoed in hallways, were coded in letters, and locked away in family archives, because in noble life, scandal wasn't the exception. It was the wallpaper, beautiful, complicated, and always hiding cracks underneath. With all their power and earthly luxury, nobles were often tormented by a lesser-known force, the crushing weight of mental uncertainty. They had everything but still wrestled with existential dread. Born in silk didn't grant them insight into the afterlife, morality, or sacred purpose. If anything, it made things worse. In Catholic France, sin clung to palace corridors like smoke. Nobles attending daily mass could still drown in debauchery every night. Confession was routine, but mostly a social performance, not real repentance. Still, many nobles, especially as they aged, were haunted by their sins. Some sought out mystics and prophets for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King, grew more religious in his final years, tormented by fear over earthly pleasures and the wars he waged. Across Europe, nobles funded churches and monasteries, not just out of piety, but as insurance. They figured nobles attending daily mass could still dive into debauchery by night. Confession was routine, but mostly to show off social decorum rather than real repentance. Still, many nobles, especially as they aged, were haunted by their sins. Some turned to mystics and prophets searching for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King, got more religious near the end, tormented by fear over his earthly pleasures and the wars he'd started. Across Europe, nobles sponsored churches and monasteries not just out of piety, but as a kind of spiritual insurance in their minds. A new chapel could clean their conscience. 1,000 candles lit in their name might atone for a life full of scheming and luxury. Some even retired to monastic life when old, swapping velvet robes for monks' habits. In Orthodox Russia, things were even tenser. Nobles were expected to uphold both political and spiritual order, yet many wrestled with doubt, especially during the chaotic reigns of czars. Those who claimed God picked them while ordering purges like it was a hobby. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer circles or followed holy fools to get closer to God. These wandering saints gave up wealth and comfort just to speak hard truths. Weird mystics like these were sometimes the only escape for nobles facing spiritual crises. Meanwhile, feudal Japan's samurai nobles often found themselves torn between chaotic ethics, Shinto rituals, and distancing themselves from Buddhism. Some nobles turned to Zen, hoping meditation would calm the chaos inside. Others wrote poetry not just for art, but to vent their souls. But they often ignored the tension between duty, honor, and life's fleeting nature. When a noble performed seppuku, it wasn't always about shame. Sometimes it was a spiritual release, despite silks and titles. Nobles often felt deep loss, surrounded by ceremony and grandeur. Many stared into space, wondering if anything really mattered. Beneath the mask of status, their souls whispered and sometimes screamed for peace. Back before smartphones and emails, the most dangerous thing a noble could send wasn't an assassin, it was a letter. Ink on parchment could wreck a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And nobles, despite their polished looks, were total pen pals. They wrote everything down: secrets, desires, plots, prayers, love, lies. These weren't your average "hey, how are you" notes. They were diplomatic and survival tools, carefully crafted at Versailles. Every noble had an archive, love letters to mistresses, desperate pleas to creditors, flattery notes to the king. Not all were straightforward. Couriers carried sealed pages with invisible ink or coded messages. One wrong phrase in the wrong hands could mean exile or the chopping block. Some nobles even had their own personal ciphers, alphabets invented just for secret chats. For example, the Duke of Orleans was known to swap letters with suspected radicals before the French Revolution, all carefully encrypted. But codes are never perfect. In one legendary case, a noble's coded diary was cracked long after his death, revealing a hidden life full of betrayal and treachery. At Habsburg courts, marriage talks often unfolded through metaphor. A letter might start with weather talk and falconry, but hide deeper meanings between the lines. Parents arranged matches with polite lies. Lovers begged to run away under the guise of visiting country estates. Back in Japan's Han era, poetry served as code. A single 31-syllable word could convey forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noblewomen were especially good at crafting double-meaning poems, usually answered within hours. These exchanges were carried by discreet messengers, sometimes servants, sometimes kids who always swore to keep quiet. During the Renaissance, some noblewomen ran entire spy networks through their beauty salons, writing letters to allies at foreign courts. In Russia, secret letters slipped out of the Tsar's inner circle helped fuel uprisings. Nobles trapped in gilded cages turned to letters as their only form of rebellion. Paper became their weapon, shield, and confessional booth. Of course, the most dangerous letters were the ones that never reached their recipients, intercepted, burned, buried, some hid in attics and wall cracks for centuries, their secrets unread, their senders long forgotten. But don't get it twisted, inside those ink-stained lines were revolutions, the deepest pain and harshest truth of a noble soul. In aristocratic society, emotions were a luxury no one could afford. Joy, anger, fear, all carefully measured, limited, or hidden away like a bad habit. Being a noble wasn't just about cash or fancy titles. It was about mastering the art of emotional camouflage. When passing judgment in court, you acted no second-guessing allowed. Life at Versailles was basically a never-ending soap opera. Nobles rehearsed their smiles, gestures, and silences. One raised eyebrow could mean support or sabotage. Tears only for funerals, and even then, only if the court cameras were rolling. The goal, elegance that masked chaos, fail, and you were labeled unstable, insane, or worse, incompetent. This emotional dance was taught from childhood. Noble kids learned to speak only when spoken to show pride without arrogance, and to stash their sadness in private diaries. Breaking down wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically dangerous. One emotional outburst could haunt you for decades, weaponized in future rivalries. At Japan's Han court, nobles were even more repressed. Public emotions, crude and uncivilized. Real feelings only came out in metaphors, carefully chosen gestures, poetry, or silence spoke volumes. A noblewoman's sleeve could say more than words. A half-open fan signaled distress. A cherry blossom picked too soon. Despair. To survive, you had to master subtlety and code. In England, nobles kept a stiff upper lip. Scandals were quietly drowned in a stiff drink, never spoken of again. Behind closed doors, newspapers mourned them. Files full of repressed sorrow and rage were leather-bound and locked away in desks. Mental illness, grief, shame all hidden behind dancing smiles and military poses. Some cracked under the pressure. Records tell of nobles collapsing mid-dance or fainting at ceremonies, then shipped off to asylums or remote estates to recover. But these tragedies were only whispered about. After all, the show had to go on because in the grand masquerade of nobility, emotions were the enemy. Masks weren't just for balls, they were everyday wear. Behind every greeting, compliment, and elegant laugh lay a storm perfectly hidden beneath silk and etiquette. Born into nobility meant inheriting not just land and titles, but crushing expectations that could break your spirit from the very first breath. A noble child wasn't just a person, they were a container for legacy. Every choice, haunted by ancestors' demands and future generations' judgments. In France, dukes' and counts' sons were raised like racehorses, their futures mapped out in ledgers and family trees. Marry now, befriend that prince. Don't embarrass the bloodline. Their lives were a continuation of a plan long before they were born, often one they couldn't change. Even women were pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's worth was measured by her dowry and pure bloodline. English nobles bore similar burdens. Firstborn sons inherited estates, debts, staff, and the job of keeping the family's reputation intact, or else. Failures were remembered not for kindness, but for losing their manners. Meanwhile, younger sons without land quietly joined the church or army. No real choice involved. In Russia, noble families treated their status like a ticking time bomb. One wrong step, one feud with the wrong factions at court, and everything could be confiscated. Heirs to a game plan set long before they were born, usually one they couldn't change. Even women were just pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's worth often measured by the strength of her dowry and the purity of her bloodline. English nobles faced the same pressure. The eldest son inherited the estate, debts, staff, and the job of keeping the family's reputation intact or worse. Losing their standing, failures weren't remembered for kindness, but for losing their manners. Meanwhile, younger sons without land or titles quietly joined the church or army, with little choice in the matter. In Russia, noble families treated their status like a ticking time bomb. One wrong move, a feud with the wrong court faction, and everything could be confiscated. Land, coastline, even the family name could be taken away. Generations of effort wiped out with a single signature. Japanese nobility was even more rigid. In ancient times, noble families competed for proximity to the emperor, status, and influence passed not by merit, but by lineage. One disgrace, a failed marriage, or a wayward child could destroy centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was crushing, and an influence passed down not by deeds, but by bloodlines. one scandal, one failed marriage. One rebellious kid could wreck centuries of reputation. The pressure to conform was massive, and individuality usually got sacrificed on the altar of duty to ancestors. But what about those who didn't want titles, didn't want to marry strangers, didn't want to run estates, or didn't want the family name rebellion? Wasn't just hard, it was basically unthinkable. Some tried, most got crushed by tradition's iron grip. The burden of inheritance wasn't just money or politics, it was psychological, a crown of thorns worn under. Being noble meant you were chained to a legacy, whether you liked it or not. Not all nobles played by the script, beneath centuries of stiff rituals and family pressure. Some cracked, some rebelled, but noble rebellions weren't always dramatic. No peasant uprisings here, no flaming torches, just quiet sabotage lurking. In palace corners, behind locked doors, or disguised as tradition at Versailles, where obedience was king, rebellion looked weird. Some nobles just skipped the king's fancy morning rituals. Big no-no. Basically allowed, I do my own thing. Others dared to wear unfashionable colors or sat for ugly portraits. Some enraged their families by marrying for love, not alliances. These tiny gestures in court politics were like ticking time bombs. In England, some nobles flipped the script by diving into art and literature. Lord Byron didn't just write poems, he mocked every noble expectation of restraint, dressed like a lady, traveled with lovers, openly dissed Parliament, his life a non-stop provocation. The less flashy nobles just vanished into the countryside, dodging London's social obligations. Even that was rebellion, a refusal to play the game. In Russia, quiet downhill slips were even sneakier. Some nobles secretly backed revolutionary ideas, masking radical philosophical debates as harmless poetry gatherings. Others helped fugitives escape or educated them, acts of treason under the Tsar's watch. These weren't noisy revolutions, but whispered betrayals of a crumbling system. Japanese nobles had even craftier rebellions, an ill-timed poem, a gift laced with insult, refusing to shave their heads for mourning, all subtle ways to say no to ceremony. Some noblewomen protested arranged marriages, with love poetry sophisticated but scandalous. Others retreated to religion, not out of piety but protest. And then there were those who just disappeared. Nobles faking illness to dodge court appearances, buried in dusty libraries, pretending to be obsessed with astronomy or botany to avoid royal nonsense. Their retreat wasn't weakness, it was defiance. These rebels rarely make history books, but their quiet choices shattered the illusion of total obedience. Not all nobles played by the rules. Some whispered no, and in their world, that whispered no was louder than any shout. Amid all the pomp and show, nobles obsessed over one thing above all: legacy, not the kind you can touch, paint, display, or pass down. Oil portraits, family crests carved in marble, huge estates with names longer than some novels. Every ball, battle, and engagement was part of an endless memory project. But here's the harsh truth. Most weren't like that. Yeah, we remember kings who started wars and queens who lost their heads, but middle-tier nobles forgotten. Their complex rituals, family dramas, and fancy shoes vanished like breath on glass. What's left are fragments, unsigned letters, crumbling estate walls, mysterious low ledger entries. The great noble's story isn't one of eternal glory. It's survival by selective memory. In France, the revolution didn't just end lives, it wiped entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits smeared. Aristocratic life wasn't a never-ending glory story. It was one of survival of the fittest. In France, the revolution didn't just end lives, it wiped entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits were smeared, names banned, the aristocracy, haunted by how history viewed them, got swept up in it. Some survived by changing names, hiding jewels in fireplaces, or fleeing to foreign courts. But their legacy wasn't what they hoped. It turned into cautionary tales, not immortal legends. English aristocrats had it better protected by law, tightly knit, organized, but even they couldn't escape, fading away. Once lively estates are now ruins. Dust covers what were once priceless rugs, great names, shattered by scandal, unhappy marriages, or just time. A lineage without heirs is a legacy without a future. In Japan, the aristocracy eventually got sidelined by the military class samurai and the shogunate. Fancy poems, court ranks, rituals faded, and even families tracing back to ancient nobility. The modern world mostly didn't care. Even the proudest names became museum labels. What about those trying to control the narrative, commissioning epic biographies, reading memoirs, sponsoring churches? They too faced history's selective memory, the real stories, the shame, secrets, compromises often lived only in whispers, footnotes, or hidden letters. At the end of the day, legacy is just the ultimate illusion. Aristocrats lived to be remembered, but mostly got totally forgotten. Behind portraits and palaces lies a quiet truth. Eternity was never real, only performance was. In spring 1900, a curious man in a wide-brimmed hat stood under the sun, staring at scattered stones and half-buried walls. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, an eccentric British archaeologist, historian, and daydreamer. He came to Crete not just to dig up ruins, but to chase a ghost specifically. English historian and eccentric dreamer. He didn't just come to Crete to dig up ruins. He was chasing a ghost, a very specific ghost, the ghost of a civilization that haunted Greek legends for centuries, an ancient culture so old it was forgotten in both history and myth. For years, travelers and locals talked about strange artifacts appearing on the hills south of Heraklion, pottery older than Mycenaean ceramics, weird hieroglyphs no one could read, and ruins that didn't quite fit any known Greek style. Evans was convinced these were traces of a Bronze Age people even older than Homer, older than Athens itself, who once ruled the Aegean. Then came the game-changing moment on a patch of land called Kefala Hill. Evans and his crew dug up a massive structure buried under centuries of dust and rubble. Walls appeared, not some simple huts, but foundations of rooms, stairs, hallways. What they were looking at wasn't a temple or fortress, it was a palace. And not just any palace. Something so complex it seemed designed to confuse anyone who stepped inside. Maybe a labyrinth. Evans immediately connected the dots. This had to be the Palace of Knossos, legendary home of King Minos. Minos, who, according to myth, locked the half-man, half-bull minotaur deep in a labyrinth beneath his house. Whether myth or not, the ruins matched the tale. Countless twisting corridors, multiple floors, mysterious dead ends, a palace that defied logic, as if built not just to hold people captive, but to trap time itself. He called the builders the Minoans. After Minos, nobody knows what they called themselves. Their writing, known as linear script, is still undeciphered, but their art, architecture, and influence suggest a long-lost empire. And so, with trowel in hand and a legend in mind, Evans started turning back the centuries. What he found would challenge everything people thought. They knew about early European civilization and kick off endless debates that still rage today. The Palace of Knossos isn't a palace in the usual sense. It's a puzzle made of corridors, courtyards, and rooms that seem to fold back on themselves after every turn, spanning over 150,000 square feet. This was a multi-level wonder of the ancient world, and at its heart, a paradox. How could something so open, bright, and advanced be so hard to map? No big walls or fortresses, no military watchtowers. Instead, Knossos had balconies, skylights, and open shafts, architectural features unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The whole complex seemed designed not for war, but for rituals, administration, and maybe just to mess with people. Spiral staircases twisted dizzyingly. Narrow corridors opened onto surprise courtyards. Rooms connected in unexpected ways. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this design was intentional, symbolizing the labyrinth myth, or just the messy result of centuries of rebuilding. Walking through Knossos means losing all sense of direction. Inside, rooms within rooms, wings connected by passages that lead nowhere. Evans believed the layout echoed the story of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who built the labyrinth for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur. No archaeological proof the monster existed, but the baffling maze-like feel here is very real. Still, the palace was more than a maze. It was an ancient engineering marvel. This complex had an advanced plumbing system, including clay pipes, flushing toilets, and drainage so efficient it would shame many 19th century European towns. Rooms had natural ventilation. Light wells brightened the inner chambers. Some staircases descended 3 or 4 floors, showing this was a rare multi-level structure before modern times. The throne room, modest by royal standards, sat deep inside, almost hidden. The centerpiece was a stone chair surrounded by frescoes of bird-headed monsters and natural ventilation. Light wells brightened the inner rooms. Some staircases dropped 3 or 4 floors down, showing this was a rare multi-level structure for its time. The throne room, modest by royal standards, sat deep inside, nearly hidden. The centerpiece was a stone chair surrounded by murals of bird-headed monsters and long benches. This wasn't a place for showboating, but for tightly controlled rituals. Maybe here, power had less to do with domination and more with illusion, mysticism, or religious awe. Knossos wasn't built to intimidate. It was built to mystify. Whether you were a merchant, a nun, or a foreign envoy, one thing was clear. Once inside, the palace would swallow you whole and make you forget how you got there. Even as the stone walls of Knossos crumble, its colors still leave a mark. Buried beneath volcanic ash and time, the palace's murals still pop like Knossos are crumbling. Its colors still leave their mark, buried under volcanic ash and time. The palace's frescoes pop like some of the most vivid, mysterious, and advanced artwork of the ancient world, unlike the stiff, warlike art of later Greek and Egyptian civilizations. Minoan frescoes are bursting with motion dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses everywhere. They weren't just decoration, they told stories, hinted at rituals, and revealed a civilization that seemed to love life, beauty, and rhythm. One of Knossos's most iconic images is the bull-leaping fresco, a young figure flipping over a giant bull in a way too graceful to be real. Is it fact? Legend historians have been debating this for over a century. Was it a ritual sport, a religious offering, or just a metaphor for taming chaos, whatever it was? This image captures the essence of Minoan life, a dangerous dance that still manages to look elegant elsewhere. The walls are bursting with lilies and saffron, monkeys and birds, spirals and waves. In the Lily Prince fresco, a slender young guy with flowing hair and an ornate crown struts confidently through a ceremony. Though Evans called him a prince, modern scholars aren't so sure. This figure might be a priest or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is flexible, symbolic, and still pretty mysterious. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans didn't focus their art on kings, wars, or conquests. No battle scenes, no slaves. Instead, there are celebrations, nature scenes, and sacred authority. Women are front and center, not stuck in the background. Bare-chested priestesses in fancy skirts and braided hair perform rituals, suggesting women might have held powerful religious roles, maybe even ruled. And those deep reds, blues, and whites still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying time itself. The vividness of the artwork hints at a society that not only valued aesthetics, but understood their emotional power. These aren't just pretty pictures, they're symbols of cosmic order, human joy, and spiritual reverence in Knossos's palace. These walls didn't just witness history, they sang it with pigments and patterns. The Minoans painted a world in motion, mysterious and full of meaning. Among Knossos's many mysteries, one stands out above all the prominence of women. Unlike many contemporary societies that sidelined women, the Minoans put them front and center, both literally and figuratively. Their images dominate frescoes, figurines, and ceremonial scenes, suggesting a civilization where women's power wasn't hidden. This festival took place in the central courtyard and the king's sacred chambers. Bare-chested women in pleated skirts and ornate headdresses appear again and again. They weren't submissive figures lurking behind kings. They stood front and center, blessing with raised hands, holding snakes, surrounded by symbols of fertility, animals, and sacred energy. Scholars believe many of these women were priestesses, mediators between mortals and gods, overseeing rituals tied to every aspect of Minoan life. One of the palace's most famous artifacts is the snake goddess statue, a woman with sharp eyes, snakes in both hands, and a cat perched on her head. Is she a goddess, a high priestess, embodying ultimate female power? We might never know. But her image tells us a lot about Knossos' spiritual hierarchy and who might have ruled at the top, unlike Egyptian pharaohs or Mycenaean kings. No clearly identified male ruler, symbols of supreme female power. We might never know for sure, but her image tells us a lot about Knossos' spiritual hierarchy and who might have stood at its top, unlike the pharaohs of Egypt or Mycenaean kings. No male Minoan ruler has ever been clearly identified in art. No giant statues of kings. No heroic battle scenes praising a lord. This has led many scholars to think Minoan society might have been matriarchal, or at least unusually egalitarian for its time. Women could hold power in religion, and possibly also in managing, leading seasonal festivals, running temples, and performing state rituals. Even the architecture reflects this balance. They managed seasonal festivals, ran temples, and performed state rituals. Even the architecture shouted balance. Rooms believed to be used by high-ranking women had direct access to temples, skylights, and private staircases, showing they could roam the palace freely. Some frescoes show women in colorful outfits parading around all solemn and equal at Knossos. Femininity was not boxed in. Pretty amazing, right? Whether priestess, leader, or icon of change, women held their own in Minoan culture. They were the culture, the voice, the vision, maybe even the soul of it. Knossos wasn't just royal digs. It was a stage for the sacred. Every hallway, courtyard, and room was dripping with spiritual intent, from underground tombs to sunlit altars. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a hotline to the gods. No Minoan holy books survive, but the architecture itself screams the rituals that shaped their world. The palace had dozens of small shrines and ritual rooms. Many were tucked away or buried underground, definitely not for public worship. Private, secretive, probably only for the elite priestesses. One chamber, often called the Desire Basin, looked like a sunken tub at the foot of a narrow staircase, not for bathing, but maybe for cleansing the body. New initiates likely snuck down quietly, purified by symbolic water before stepping into sacred ceremonies. The large, open central courtyard, open to the sky, was probably the hub of public rituals. Hundreds could gather here for seasonal festivals, celebrating fertility, renewal, or the New Year's transition. The rhythmic beat of drums, twirling dancers, chanting priestesses. Knossos was always alive with ritual, and the bull symbol, a powerful emblem of energy and ferocity, was everywhere, and the image of the bull a powerhouse symbol of energy, aggression, and Mother Nature's mood swings was front and center in these rituals. All over the palace, huge stylized bullhorns were mounted high on walls and entrances. These offering horns, as Evans called them, marked the sacred doorways, paired with bull-jumping frescoes. It's clear this beast packed some serious religious punch. Some folks even think a live bull might have been part of certain ceremonies, not for brutal sacrifice, but as a co-star in a spiritual show reflecting the eternal dance of chaos and order. The double axe, or labrys, was another quirky symbol tied to Gnosis's sacred spaces, found on pillars and walls. It could be a tool, a weapon, or some divine bling. Its frequent pairing with female figures just screams goddess-centered religion. No traditional temples here. The palace itself was the temple. Every staircase was a parade. Every room a chapel. It was where spirit and politics threw a never-ending party, and sacred vibes were woven into every wall. Amid frescoes, altars, and winding rooms, archaeologists uncovered something even weirder: writing. Hundreds of clay tablets etched with symbols nobody fully gets yet. This is Linear A, the Minoans script, one of the last great ancient writing systems, still holding its secrets tight. Found during Evans's digs, Linear A looks a lot like another Greek writing called Linear B's from the Mycenaean era. Evans guessed they were related, and spoiler, he was right. But while Linear B got cracked, revealing it was an early form of Greek, Linear A stubbornly refuses to spill the beans. It's a language unrelated to Greek, and maybe unrelated to any known language on Earth. We can read the characters phonetically, but have zero clue what they mean. Most Linear A tablets found at Knossos are administrative lists, grain, oil, livestock, or offerings, but without knowing the language. Their purpose is a guessing game. Are they taxes, offerings, market records? No one's sure. The Minoans wrote for over 500 years, but we still can't read a single complete sentence. This language gap gives Knossos a dreamlike glow. It's like listening to music through a wall. You catch the rhythm, the energy, the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We see their rituals in art, their architecture in stone, but their thoughts remain locked away. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, then accidentally baked hard, preserved, only because the palace burned down. Without that disaster, their words might have vanished into thin air long ago. Ironically, burning Knossos gave us the only surviving fragments of the Minoan language. Some scholars hope Linear A might be cracked someday, especially if a bilingual text pops up like how the Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with isolated symbols: a man, a bull, a jar, a child. Meaningless, yet hauntingly familiar. Knossos, with all its color and complexity, speaks to us only in silence. Its language is out of reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices are still waiting to be heard, not buried underground, but lost in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, didn't vanish overnight after a great flood. Without that disaster, their words would probably be long gone. Ironically, burning Gnosos gave us the only surviving fragments of the Minoan language. Some scholars think Linear A might one day be cracked, especially if bilingual texts pop up, like how the Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with random symbols: a man, a bull, a jar, a kid. Nonsense, yet hauntingly familiar. Knossos, with all its colors and complexity, speaks to us only in silence. Its language is out of reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices are still waiting to be heard, not buried underground but lost in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, didn't vanish in a flood. Its collapse was slow, layer by layer, a gradual decay of a civilization that once seemed eternal. And like many ancient falls, the truth behind Knossos' ruin is a mix of fire, water, eternal, and like many ancient collapses, the truth behind Knossos' fall is a full-on panorama of fire, water, and whispered wars. Around 1450 BC, something changed. Suddenly, all over Crete, Minoan palaces and towns started burning. Oddly, Knossos didn't fall right away. Instead, it was retaken, but the murals changed. Writing on clay tablets switched from Linear A to Linear B's not Minoan script, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, a rising power from the mainland, either invaded or peacefully took control after some disaster weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Knossos was no longer ruled by the locals. One theory blames the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion on Santorini, north of Crete, around 1600 BC. This disaster was one of the most powerful recorded in history, leveling the area with earthquakes and tsunamis. The chaos might have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them wide open for invasion or internal collapse. Others think it was a slow economic and political decline, as trade routes shifted and rivals grew stronger. The centralized power of Knossos might have just fallen apart. Palaces once buzzing with activity became more like boring office buildings. Quieter, administrative, rituals gave way to record-keeping. Art bowed out for copycat versions. By 1375 BC, the palace was totally abandoned. Fires raged down the halls, roofs collapsed, walls cracked and warped. Knossos was left silent, colors faded, language forgotten, rituals lost. But it was never truly gone. The legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur still lived on in Greek mythology. Minoan influence showed up, again in Mycenaean palaces and later classical art and architecture. The spirit of Knossos lingered like smoke, invisible but still there. Today, its ruins are out in the sun. Tourists stroll where priestesses once danced, and the palace that once held a civilization now hides secrets that are obvious, grand, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans discovered Knossos in 1900, he didn't just dig it up. He rebuilt it with a mix of academic ambition and artistic vision. Evans wasn't content to just preserve ruins. He wanted to restore them. He believed that exposing the foundations wasn't enough. The world needed to see the palace as he imagined it, colorful, complex, and inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in archaeological history, using concrete, a material totally foreign to the Bronze Age. Evans reconstructed parts of the palace with modern methods. He hired artists to repaint frescoes from the fragments found, but often filled in missing details based on guesswork, not facts. Balconies were rebuilt. Columns weren't restored with dull stone, but painted bright red with black tops, reflecting Evans's idea of Minoan aesthetics. Roofs were added, walls replastered, and the ancient palace slowly turned into a mashup, half ruin, half Edwardian fantasy. Some praised his boldness. They argued that without Evans, Knossos might just be a boring pile of rubble. His restoration made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally engaging. Visitors can walk through lively corridors, admire vibrant murals, and imagine the Minoan world clearer than ever. But others see it differently. Critics say Evans went too far, imposing his own interpretation on a civilization we still barely understand. For example, some frescoes are almost entirely inventions based on tiny original paint fragments. Entire palace areas, like the famous throne room, may have been assigned roles they never had. By shaping the ruins to fit mythology, Evans blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos stands as both a wonder and a monument to the complexities of reconstructing history. Evans's vision can't be separated from the site. His concrete creations still stand. His artistic interpretations still decorate the walls. But visitors walking through Knossos juggle two thoughts: what the Minoans might have actually built, and what one overly enthusiastic archaeologist believed they did. When trying to resurrect Knossos, Evans basically gave us two palaces, one buried underground, the other a wild imagination towering above it all. Today, the Palace of Knossos isn't just a ruin, it's a bridge between myth and history, imagination and evidence, Europe and the ancient world. Long after the last ritual was done and the halls went silent, Knossos keeps pulling us in, mysterious, tempting, and seriously puzzling. Its existence challenges everything we think we know about early civilization and forces us to admit, yeah, we don't know much. This palace rewrote Europe's history timeline. Before its discovery, most scholars thought advanced civilization kicked off with the Greeks. Knossos said, "Hold my wine." Here was a culture thriving 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, city planning, international trade, and some seriously iconic art. The Minoans at Knossos, not cavemen. They were sophisticated, emotional, and had soul. But Knossos's legacy can't be separated from its mythology. For millennia, the Minotaur story in the labyrinth was dismissed as just a spooky fairy tale or a party story. Yet, when archaeologists dug up a palace with hundreds of rooms, twisting corridors, and bull symbols carved in stone, the line between myth and history started to blur. Maybe this legend wasn't made up but passed down, filtered through generations until only fragments remained. In modern times, Knossos inspires not just scholars, but writers, artists, and architects. Its double axes, horned symbols, and swirling frescoes pop up in fashion, sculpture, even sci-fi. The idea of an ancient civilization hidden under the Mediterranean still sparks the imagination. A vision of an era where power wasn't about pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Still, Knossos reminds us of fragility. The palace collapsed, its language vanished, the people disappeared, and the true original meaning and purpose, that's still up for debate. Every interpretation is a mirror not just reflecting the past, but what we want to believe about it. Take a stroll through the museum halls today. Stand where nuns once prayed, dancers twirled, and kids laughed. You're standing in the heart of Europe's oldest palace, a place caught between sunlight and shadow, between architecture and legend. Knossos may never spill all its secrets, but in its silence, it still whispers mystery, memory, and the deep, twisting path of civilization. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born December 15th, 37 A.D., a child of wealth, but also a child of poison. His lineage was royal, tangled with the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome, with a mix of glory and suspicion. His mother, young Agrippina, was Emperor Caligula's sister, Augustus's granddaughter, and one of the craftiest politicians around. His dad, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was infamous for being arrogant and brutal. Legend says when someone congratulated him on his son's birth, he muttered, "Agrippina and I can only produce monsters." Prophecy or bitterness time would tell. At just 2, Nero lost his dad either to dropsy or poison. In Rome, where alliances could kill and ambition was a bloody sport, Agrippina became a widow with a son, but no real power. But she was patient. She watched her brother Caligula turn into a dictator and get offed by his own soldiers. She stayed quiet as Claudius, the stammering bookworm uncle, got draped in the purple cloak. Then she made her move. The sister of Emperor Caligula, granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the craftiest politicians of her time. Her dad, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was famously arrogant and brutal. They say when someone congratulated him on having a son, he muttered, "Agrippina and I can only produce monsters." Was that prophecy or just bitterness? Time will tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his dad to dropsy, or maybe poison, bitterness. Only time will tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his dad to edema, or maybe poison. In Rome, where alliances were deadly and ambition a blood sport, Agrippina was now a widow with a kid, but no real power. Yet she stayed patient. She watched her brother Caligula turn into a dictator and get offed by his own soldiers. She stayed quiet when Claudius, the stammering scholar uncle, got draped in the purple toga. Then she made her move. By 49 AD, Agrippina had seduced Emperor Claudius, her uncle, and married him. She wasn't shy about her ambitions. Within a year, she convinced him to name her son heir, snubbing his own biological kid, Britannicus. Lucius became Nero, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, try saying that 3 times fast, definitely an emperor-worthy name. She arranged his engagement to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, and hired Rome's best tutors to school him. Leading the pack was a Stoic philosopher, Seneca, who tried to mold the young lad into a noble ruler from the outside. Nero looked like he was on track for greatness, trained in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music. He learned how to charm crowds, recite Homer, and manipulate public opinion, but Agrippina was still the one holding the reins. She showed up at every ceremony, managed the household, and made it very clear who was really in charge. Nero's rise wasn't fate. It was the work of a mother who had crowned herself queen long before her son wore the crown, and inside that ambitious, so scheming greenhouse, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly planted. In 54 AD, at just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive dad, died officially of illness, though lots suspected poison, with Agrippina as the prime suspect. She'd been done waiting for a while, and when Claudius started reconsidering his biological son, the heir Britannicus, she made her move. Legend has it that mushrooms were the delivery method food of the gods. Some joked darkly, and maybe also food for murder. After Claudius died, Nero quickly took the throne. The Roman Senate gave a thumbs up. The Praetorian Guard clapped, and Agrippina stood triumphant behind him, decked out in gold and flanked by guards the real mastermind of the regime. But she wasn't raising an emperor. She created a puppet. In Nero's early months, Rome flourished. He's essayed, lavished rewards on soldiers, hosted public games, and promised a return to Augustus's values. Behind the scenes, 2 key players ran the show: Seneca, the philosopher turned speechwriter, and Burrus, the practical head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they guided Nero through tough choices while keeping up a dignified, controlled facade. But Agrippina wasn't content just watching from the sidelines. She wanted to rule alongside her son, and as Nero started asserting his independence, tensions exploded. At first, the battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins next to Nero's image, a first for any Roman mother. She barged into state meetings uninvited. She constantly reminded Nero who put him on the throne. The young emperor grew uneasy under her thumb. He began surrounding himself with personal advisors, interested only in pleasures and the arts, not duty. He fell for Acte, a former slave, which terrified Agrippina. She had royal marriages in mind, not love stories with commoners. The mother-son bond started to sour. Whispered rumors filled the palace with fights, slammed doors, and quiet threats. Agrippina, once revered as queenmaker, now seemed like a terrifying threat. Rome gave Nero a throne, but Agrippina held the leash, and Nero was reaching for a knife. His reign began with promises, poetry, and applause, but behind the curtain, family tragedy was smoldering, one that would stain the imperial purple with blood. By 59 AD, The imperial palace had turned into a battleground not for armies, but for wills. Officially, Nero was emperor, but his mother Agrippina loomed like a dark cloud over every decision. She undermined his power, opposed his personal life, and schemed to replace him with Britannicus, Claudius's biological son. Nero, once a compliant boy trapped by a liar, had become a desperate young man wanting to break free from her grip. He acted first. Britannicus, the real threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died at a... It all kicked off with a dagger. His reign started with promises, poetry, and applause, but behind the curtain, a family tragedy was simmering, a mess that would stain the royal purple with blood. By 59 AD, the palace had turned into a battlefield not for soldiers, but for wills. Officially, Nero was emperor, but his mom, Agrippina, loomed like a dark cloud over every decision. She undermined his power, controlled his personal life, and plotted to replace him with Britannicus, Claudius's biological son. Nero, once a compliant kid trapped by a liar, morphed into a desperate young man itching to break free from her grip. He made the first move. Britannicus, the real threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died at a dinner party. Guests claimed he choked on wine, but the poison worked too fast for that to be a coincidence. Nero denied involvement. Few bought it. Agrippina definitely didn't. After Britannicus was out of the picture, Nero's next problem was his mother. She used to rule through him. Now, he saw her as a rival. Agrippina wasn't just hungry for power, she was relentless. She secretly met with senators, pitched nobles she hoped would take over, subtly threatened the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, and worst of all, for Nero, everyone still adored her. The Romans loved a strong woman, as long as she wasn't too strong. Agrippina crossed that line. Nero's first attempt exile. He stripped her of her guards, banned her from public appearances, and sent her to live in a coastal villa. But distance didn't shut her up. She kept exchanging letters, whispering, pulling strings. So Nero chose a darker path. He invited Agrippina to a grand party and gifted her a fancy boat for the trip home, designed to sink in the middle of the sea. When the boat was sabotaged and shattered, Agrippina survived and swam away, which was actually rigged to sink in the middle of the sea when the boat got sabotaged and smashed apart. Agrippina survived and swam ashore under the moonlight. This failed attempt made Nero angry and embarrassed, so he tried again. This time, he sent assassins to her villa with the excuse of an urgent message. Stories vary, but one says she calmly faced her killers, telling them to strike her belly, the very place that gave birth to Nero. Her assassination shocked the entire empire. Nero's guilt hit him hard and fast. He couldn't sleep. He paced all night long. He saw her ghost in the hallways. All of Rome whispered about the unthinkable crime of an emperor killing his own mother after Agrippina's death. Nero finally broke free, but in doing so, he also cut the last remaining tie. What followed was a reign with zero shame and a downhill slide into disgrace. After Agrippina was out of the picture, Nero officially became emperor. No more whispers, no more motherly supervision, just unlimited power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquest or government reform, Nero turned inward. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be admired as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, a performer. He actually performed in public, something no Roman emperor had dared to do, to the Senate and aristocrats. This was shameful in Roman tradition. The stage was for slaves and foreigners, but Nero didn't flinch. Trained in music and drama, he demanded applause and packed outdoor theaters with eager fans. The emperor didn't just throw games, he starred in them. Nero wrote poetry, sang tragic songs, and recited epic poems he penned himself. He was proud of his singing voice and even went through bizarre treatments to preserve it, including ritual vomiting, long silent retreats, and weird diets. Senators sat through hours of performances, too scared to leave their seats. No applause could mean exile or worse. He also poured resources into building theaters, sponsoring sports contests, and redesigning Rome to reflect his aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like Neuronia, a mix of Olympic sports and theatrical contests, where surprise, surprise, Nero always took first place. His obsession with performing even spilled over into foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on entering every art contest. At the Olympic Games, he raced a chariot with 10 horses instead of the usual 4. He fell off mid-race, but was still declared the winner. Why, because he would have won if he hadn't fallen. A win in Nero's eyes. Meanwhile, even as he drowned in these creative daydreams, the empire groaned. Managers were neglected. Governors ran wild without supervision. Provinces became unstable, but Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus, Apollo, or something greater, a music god with absolute power. To Rome's elite, he was becoming the nation's embarrassment, but to the masses, fed bread, games, and endless entertainment, Nero was just a living spectacle, a flawed god on stage, singing over the cracks in his crumbling empire. In July 64th AD, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, the flames spread across the city like a divine curse. Rome's narrow, crowded, flammable streets turned into a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the empire's capital burned down. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were left homeless. Temples, homes, markets all gone. And where was the emperor? Rumors spread everywhere. Some claimed Nero watched the fire from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy, his crumbling empire. In July 64th AD, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, flames spread across the city like a divine curse. Rome's narrow, crowded, flammable streets turned into a blazing furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the empire's capital burned to the ground. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were homeless. Temples, homes, markets gone. And where was the emperor? Rumors flew everywhere. Some said Nero watched the fire from a tower, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. Others claimed he ordered the blaze to clear space for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in fact, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, but when he returned, he put on a dramatic show opening his private gardens to refugees, organizing emergency food distribution, and funding the rebuild. But the whispers didn't stop. People needed a scapegoat, and Nero, the playwright emperor, gave them one. He blamed the Christians suddenly. They were the untrustworthy ones, a weird little Jewish cult worshiping a guy who got nailed to a cross and refusing to honor Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson and kicked off a brutal crackdown that lasted for centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, nailed to crosses, and the most horrifying of all, burned alive as torches for Nero's garden parties. Justice? Nope. More like a fiery theater production. Meanwhile, Nero revealed his true ambition, the Golden House. On the ashes of Rome's center, he started building an unimaginably lavish palace with man-made lakes, gold-plated walls, revolving dining rooms, and ceilings dripping with perfume. It was a monument to excess. They even planned a giant statue of himself, the colossal Nero god, towering over everything for many Romans. This confirmed their worst suspicions. Nero didn't just let the city burn down. Nope. He used the fire like a blank canvas. He wiped out old Rome to build a new one in his own image. But Nero saw it differently. In his mind, he wasn't destroying anything. He was creating. He was rebuilding Rome as a dramatic, magnificent, unforgettable masterpiece. In his quest to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero set the world ablaze and lit the fuse on his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, applause faded and fear took over. The emperor who once danced on stage now paced the palace halls, spiraling into paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant behind smeared makeup. After the fire and his unpopular Golden House, Nero's standing in the Senate plummeted fast. The nobles, offended by his performances and extravagance, now feared for their lives. In 65 AD, a plot was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, involving dozens of senators, knights, even soldiers plotting to overthrow him. Some wanted to bring back the Republic. Others just wanted anyone but Nero. His response was quick and ruthless. The poet Lucan, philosopher Seneca, and General Fenius Rufus were all ordered to kill themselves. Seneca, Nero's former tutor and moral compass, calmly slit his wrists while discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those rumored to sympathize with the plot got swept up in the purge. The palace became an execution ground. The Senate chamber turned into a silent theater of obedience. Nero's paranoia deepened. He accused his wife, Octavia, of adultery, a charge so weak it insulted even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his lover, Poppaea Sabina, as a twisted love token, but even Poppaea wasn't safe. In a drunken rage, or maybe during a fight, Nero kicked her in the belly while she was pregnant. She died shortly after. Some say he cried for days. Others say he mourned losing his muse, not the woman herself. Poison became his go-to weapon. He relied on Lusta, a notorious poisoner, a woman who could off emperors and rivals with her concoctions. By Nero's orders, she trained others, creating a mini macabre school of assassination. At this point, Nero's court looked like a bloody stage. Every friend was a suspect, every ally a potential traitor, and all the while, Nero kept singing, performing, convinced he was loved. Submission. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his wife, Octavia, of cheating, a charge so weak it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his lover, Poppaea Sabina, as some twisted love trophy. But even Poppaea wasn't safe. In a fit of rage, or maybe during a drunken argument, Nero kicked her belly while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say he cried for days. Others think he mourned losing his muse, not the woman herself. Poison became Nero's go-to weapon in his arsenal. He relied on Lusta, a notorious poisoner, a woman who could kill emperors and rivals alike with her concoctions. On Nero's orders, she skilled. He trained others, basically building a tiny Makar assassination academy. At this point, Nero's court looked less like a government and more like a bloody drama stage. Every so-called friend was a suspect, every ally a potential backstabber. Meanwhile, Nero kept singing and performing, fully convinced everyone adored him. Spoiler alert, the audience was shrinking. The laughs started sounding nervous, and those knives, yeah, they got a lot closer. While Nero was busy partying and purging in Rome, the empire outside the capital was falling apart. The provinces, long the backbone of Roman power, were unraveling under neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. High taxes, corrupt governors, and a military reputation crumbling faster than a stale baguette. Out in the empire's backwaters, patience ran out and rebellion flared up. The first crack came from the east. In 66 AD, the province of Judea exploded into full-scale revolt. Tensions had been simmering for years between Rome and the Jews, thanks to religious oppression and heavy taxes. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated sacred temples and looted the treasury, open warfare broke out. The First Jewish-Roman War had begun, and Rome was in for a costly headache. Nero sent one of his best generals, Vespasian, to crush the revolt. Ironically, this move would later spell disaster for Nero's reign. Meanwhile, out west, the storm clouds were gathering fast. In Gaul and Spain, Roman legions started grumbling. Nero's lavish lifestyle, his destruction of Rome, and his cruelty were eating away at the loyalty of nobles and soldiers alike. Governors like Julius Vindex in Gaul openly declared rebellion in 68 AD, calling Nero a disgrace to Rome, a vain performer unworthy of the purple robe. Vindex's rebellion failed militarily, but scored a political win. It gave others the courage to follow suit. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the powerful governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, refused to recognize Nero's authority and declared himself legatus of the Senate and Roman people. This was the first public call for regime change. Back in Rome, panic took hold. Nero's supporters started fleeing or turning their backs on him. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, got bolder. The Praetorian Guard, once Nero's strongest protectors, were now bought off by Galba's spies. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was up for sale. Nero scrambled to rally support. He cried, begged, even thought about fleeing to the eastern provinces and returning as a famous artist. But it was too late. The empire had turned its back on its so-called idol. Nero was completely isolated. The provinces that once cheered his rise now lit the fuse of his downfall. The emperor had lost his stage, and now the curtain was falling. By June 68th AD, Nero was emperor in name only. The Senate had switched sides. The Praetorian Guard, once his iron wall, declared loyalty to Galba, the people of Rome, who had once been entertained by his games and theater, now watched silently, holding their breath. The empire Nero wanted to turn into his stage had no audience left. When Nero woke up on June 9th, the messengers delivered the verdict that sealed his fate. The Senate declared him a public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed the traditional Roman way, pooled or beaten to death naked, his head trapped by a trident-shaped staff. The man who once performed for adoring crowds was now to die in humiliation and solitude. Terrified, Nero disguised himself and fled Rome, dressed in rags and accompanied by a few loyal freed soldiers. They took refuge at the villa of his former secretary, located in the countryside outside the city, in a dark, overgrown garden. The last Julio Claudian emperor hid in a ditch, listening to the sound of approaching horsemen, even in his last moments. Nero's obsession with his legacy didn't fade. Hearing the distant hoofbeats, he reportedly cried out, "A true artist has died within me." He lamented that it wasn't Rome that was dying, but himself, his talent, his image, and his tragic end. His companions urged him to commit suicide, but he hesitated, despite his cruelty. Nero was a coward when it came to death. The once adoring crowd now wanted him dead in disgrace and isolation. Panicked, Nero disguised himself and fled Rome, wearing rags and with a handful of loyal freed soldiers. They took refuge at his former secretary's villa, located in the countryside outside the city, in a dark, tangled garden. The last Julio Claudian emperor hid out in a ditch, ears tuned for approaching horse hooves, even in his final hours. Nero's obsession with his own legacy never faded. Hearing the distant horses, legend has it, he cried out, "A true artist has died within me." He lamented that it wasn't Rome dying, but himself, his talent, his image, and his tragic end. His companions urged him to kill himself, but he hesitated. Brutal as he was, Nero was surprisingly chicken when it came to dying. Eventually, as soldiers closed in, with some help from a freed slave named Epaphroditus, he stabbed himself in the throat. The blade sank in, but death didn't come right away. As blood filled his lungs, the slave whispered, "It's too late now. This is loyalty." He was just 30 years old. The soldiers found his barely breathing body, shocked. The Senate, now led by Galba, ordered a simple grave for him. No state funeral, no religious rites, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign. After Nero's death, the dying body of the man, totally stunned, the Senate, now under Galba's command, ordered him buried in a simple grave. No state funeral, no fancy religious rites, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign. After Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, came to a screeching halt. What followed was a fresh storm, civil war, chaos, and the quick rise and fall of emperors. But one thing was crystal clear. Rome would never forget Nero. The second his body went cold, legends started popping up. Some Romans cheered, others mourned, and a few whispered that he wasn't really dead, that he'd escaped east and would one day come back. Over the next few decades, no fewer than 3 impostors claiming to be Nero reborn showed up in Asia Minor, armed with lies and catchy songs. Looks like Nero's legend was just getting started. For many in the Roman elite, his legacy was clear. Nero was a monster, a madman who killed his own mother, burned the Capitol, and shamed the empire with his narcissistic antics. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio painted him as a cautionary tale, an artist emperor swallowed by vanity. But not everyone agreed. Among the lower classes, Nero was strangely beloved. He cut taxes, built public baths, threw huge games, and handed out grain. He gave Rome some of its best showbiz moments. Some even saw him as a populist, crude sure, but generous. Centuries later, Christian texts kept painting him as pure evil, with early writers calling Nero the first Antichrist and maybe the beast from Revelation. He was remembered not just as a bad ruler, but as a cosmic villain. Yet, there's something oddly magnetic about Nero's story. He wasn't a cold, calculating tyrant like Tiberius or Caligula. He was flashy, impulsive, and sometimes downright bonkers. He ruled like a man trapped in an eternal daydream, thinking he was a poet, a god, and a tragic hero all rolled into one. Even his death felt like a scene ripped from a lost Greek tragedy. Centuries later, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers resurrected Nero as a symbol of lost greatness. A ruler so obsessed with beauty, he couldn't stomach the ugliness of power. His name became shorthand for excess and decline, a lesson in what happens when ego swallows an empire. But maybe Nero's weirdest legacy is this: he turned power into performance. He understood, centuries before mass media, That image could be as powerful as policy. Control the story, and you shape the memory of the future. In that sense, he got exactly what he wanted 2,000 years later. We still remember Nero not because he ruled Rome, but because he etched his name into history.